the blood of Africa in your veins? Or did they pretend to be blind to your color and thereby deny its value? What did you want? Did anyone explain the nature of freedom? Did anyone explain the nature of racism? Did anyone explain the nature of love? Did anyone know anything about these things? Did anybody know anything? What did you learn today?
And you go off in the bush, and all of a sudden you run into this little group of people they call Negrillos. How did they get there? You go to Guam, and you find a little group of people called Chimoros, little Moors. How did they get there? You go into Vietnam, and you find these black people in Vietnam. How did they get there? How did the people get on the island of Fiji? How did they get to Australia? How did they get to Mexico and Central America before Columbus? You see, so the question of the movement, you see, the image of African people as movers on their own independent steam is not a part of the picture that we painted of African people. But it's counter to the fact, because the fact is that African people were the first migrants in the first place.
You're listening to some of the sounds of Africa from Brazil, Tobago,
it's a long time, girl, me never see you. Oh, let me hold your hand.
and in America. Now we want you to see some of the sons and daughters of Africa in Russia, in the Philippines, and in the royal history of England. Some of these faces and places might surprise you. That's because most of our history books and many of our educators want you to believe that Africans only left Africa because of European slavery. Nothing could be further from the truth.
No people ever migrated as much as Africans. When Henrik the Red went into Iceland, he found black people. He reported it. The Vikings found blacks among them, Thorhall the hunter, Thorstein. Africans among the Vikings. When the Romans attacked Britain, they found Africans. They said there were people as dark as Ethiopians among the fair-skinned Britons.
But more than that, if Africans had not left their continent of origin, Europeans, Asians, and the entire world's population would not exist.
This is one way that our thinking has changed over the years, that we used to think that we had to explain why it is that blacks are black. Well, now we realize that it makes perfectly good sense for people who live in Africa to be black, and what we need to explain is why are whites white.
As we discussed in part 3 of this series, the first Africans, who were also the first people, began to populate Europe and the rest of the world thousands of years ago as Homo erectus. During segment 3 of this video series, we also explained items number 1 and 2 of Dr. Hilliard's 10 points in African history. Those migrations, starting with Homo erectus, is an era we'll call the first wave of African migrations. It essentially planted humanity. For the second major wave of African migration, we must move forward several thousand years to the Egyptian Empire. According to Dr. Hilliard and Dr. Van Sertima, the people of Kemet, which we know by its Greek name Egypt, held the Khoikhoi of southern Africa in high esteem. Modern science tells us these Khoikhoi, or San people, were the world's first Homo sapiens sapiens, or modern men. The Kemites also claim they came from the mountains of the moon, either an area near Uganda or Kenya. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima says it's an idea that now has some scientific support.
We had thought, and Chancellor Williams and even I had said in our books, that it's an Afro-Asiatic language. Now we have proof beyond beyond any question that the Egyptian language is not Afro-Hamitic or Afro-Asiatic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-anything. It is fundamentally African. Those elements that came in later from other places and other peoples, those are surface elements, lexical elements, words here and there, which comes into every language, and they have nothing to do with the fundamental grammatical structure of Egyptian language, which is African.
Egypt also brings us to the third wave of African migration. This took place in and around the 25th dynasty, and probably during the reign of this man, Taharqa. Now, before we tell you about the migration, let's talk about the people. It's important to remember that the country of Egypt is in Africa. Its original people were Africans. They described themselves as black and were described as having black skin and woolly hair by noted Greeks and Romans. Any doubts about their racial heritage can be removed by looking at these stone photographs. You can also see some of the same faces in Mexico.
The Olmec heads are kind of an embarrassment in that they widely and for a long time been recognized as looking black. They don't look like the typical, we've all seen these Aztec figures with the long noses and very hatchet-faced people. The Olmec heads, on the other hand, are sort of wide and oblong and with flat noses and thick lips and you know, very black looking.
How do you explain them getting there?
I don't.
Dr. Van Sertima says the ancient Africans sailed to the New World in boats such as these. Built of reed, able to hold more than 50 people, they could move incredibly fast.
The catamaran in the Pacific, they have found these jointed canoes, which are not really canoes. The canoe is a misnomer. Jointed boats that were extremely sturdy, far sturdier than the Asiatic boats. And they found one of them with 48 men, 24 rowing, 24 resting, which could cross so fast, it could move from Puerto Rico to Venezuela in a single day. Rivers in the world, the Nile and the Niger. They spent more time on those waters than they spent on other roads. They had about 12 types of ships on the Niger, not even counting the Nile, which had 3,000 years of shipbuilding. It gave its ideas to the Phoenicians, who were the great navigators of the early world. You find, for example, on the Indian Ocean, the Mughals of India were so impressed by African ideas about the sea and their ships that they made them admirals of the Indian Ocean, a people known as the cities, and African sea-going people were made admirals of the Indian Ocean by the Mughals of India. The Chinese report Africans were bringing elephants to them in ships to the court of China 2 centuries before Columbus. You can't take elephants across the Indian Ocean in a dugout.
But the Africans of Egypt's last cultural dynasty also sailed the seas in smaller vessels such as these, a feat Atlanta cardiologist Dr. Arthur Lee knows about personally.
Abu Bakr had made the crossing probably 1311 with a fleet of 400 ships. He was a king in Mali, and there were other voyages who made it earlier. If you're from, say, Spanish Sahara, you have to get out offshore about 100 miles to get into the region of the Northeast trades. When I made the trip, I started out from the Canary Islands, and we were in Grand Canary. We left in the evening, about 4 hours sailing time, heading due south. We picked up the Northeast trades, and we carried them all the way right into the Caribbean. It's a real easy trip. Take it some time.
Doctors Lee and Van Sertima say these African travelers were able to catch cross currents in the Atlantic to bring them back and forth. Dr. Van Sertima also says certain types of plants, which were a hybrid of North American and African origin, grew in Africa before Columbus came. These plants further support the world travel theory. And then there's the matter of maps.
What is extraordinary about this map is that it shows the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates between the